Hey, peace and salutations, good people. I hope that you are as well as possible as you listen to this. Welcome to The Paper Plane. The Paper Plane is a podcast created and hosted by myself, Colin Masashi Rohahio Ehara, where I interview folks I am blessed and honored to share community with, asking them about a book or books that have had a transformative impact on their lives. In a society where literacy rates are steadily declining, our attention spans and critical consciousness are under attack, and a growing number of podcasts hosted by cishet men consciously or unconsciously champion expressions of masculinity that come at the expense of women, femmes, female bodied folks, and LGBTQIA Two Spirit Plus, especially BIPOC people. This space imperfectly aims to operate as a counter narrative to those things. The paper plane is a space that intends to highlight the dire importance of relationships, community, dialogue, perpetual learning, honest expression as art, art as honest expression, freedom for literacy, and of course, literacy for freedom. It speaks to planes of existence attached to the act of reading, but also as a metaphor for the flights we take as we sit in what Ta-Nehisi Coates calls a one-way interface as readers and how these journeys shape us. Today's guest is someone who I had the very fortunate privilege of meeting at San Francisco State University over 15 years ago when we both were pursuing master's degrees in the now famous and infamous College of Ethnic Studies. As teaching assistants in Dr. Jeff Duncan-Andrade's Raza 580 educational equity course, and shortly after working in the East Oakland Step to College program at Fremont High School with Jeff and Dr. Patrick Camangian, I remember being taken aback by this brother's deep sensitivity, thoughtfulness, and humility as it pertained to the work of supporting young people emerging from historically dispossessed communities, but also by the ways he balanced these things with an unshakable confidence and tongue-in-cheek sense of humor. Fast forward more than a decade later, today's guest reached out to me as I was pushing through a majorly challenging occupational transition in my life, letting me know that he'd completed his PhD, was now the chair of ethnic studies at Diablo Valley College, and was wondering if I or anyone I knew might be interested in applying to teach classes there. One of the texts we'll be discussing today is Wandering Stars. And when I tell you that many wandering stars aligned in this moment to help usher me into the next phase of my professional life, please believe I am as serious as a heart attack. This good brother played a truly pivotal role in supporting me as I transitioned into teaching in higher education at the community college level. And for this and many reasons, I will forever be grateful to know and walk beside him in the deeply important and challenging work of critical, liberatory, and humanizing education here in the East Bay on unceded Bay and Plains Miwok Confederated Villages of Lijan and Muwekma Ohlone Territory. Dr. Dani Ahuicapatzin Cornejo Opata Chicano Picunche Chileno is a husband, father, son, brother, uncle, and community member. He is also an assistant professor and chair of ethnic studies at Diablo Valley College in Pleasant Hill, California. He received his PhD from the Department of Native American Studies at UC Davis. His work is focused on the study of indigenous holistic pedagogical strategies from a hemispheric perspective, as well as the application of these strategies in the service of urban Native youth and other underserved communities in the Bay Area. He has designed and taught courses in the fields of Native American studies, urban education, and comparative ethnic studies at the University of San Francisco, the University of California, Davis, San Francisco State University, Chabot College, and Diablo Valley College. He has also published on topics such as indigenous cultural reclamation and educational equity. Dr. Cornejo has also worked as a public school K-12 educator serving second language learners in Denver, Colorado, and high school students as the assistant director of the East Oakland Step to College program. Dani has been a practitioner of the Mexicayo tradition through Danza Azteca and Temazcali Sweat Lodge since 2004 and has facilitated Nahuatl language courses for beginning speakers situated within Mexicayo epistemologies taught through the oral traditions of Flor y Canto and Danza Azteca. Finally, since 2004, he has served as the co-musical director and co-producer for the hip hop and world music collective Debajo del Agua, an experience that has opened opportunities for teaching world music ensembles centered in the indigenous and African diaspora of the Americas. And with that, I am so grateful and so honored to welcome Dr. Dani Ahuicapatzin Cornejo to the paper plane. Dr. Dani, how are you doing, brother? It's so good to see you. Thank you for being here today.
Yoseminobe, it's great to see you too, my brother.
Man,
I'm doing great on this beautiful day.
I'm so glad to hear that, and so excited to talk to you about these powerful texts that you've chosen. And so to jump into kind of introducing these books, so Dr. Dani has chosen Bad Indians by Deborah Miranda and They're There and Wandering Stars by one of my favorite writers, Tommy Orange. Bad Indians, a tribal memoir, is a mixed genre book by Deborah Miranda, published by Heyday Books in 2013. The book is part tribal history of the California Mission Indians and part family memoir. It combines different media and genres, including oral histories, newspaper clippings, anthropological recordings, poems, and personal reflection to narrate the stories of Miranda's family, who are members of the Ohlone Costanoan Eselen Nation, a nonprofit organization that self-identifies as a Native American tribe, along with the experiences of California indigenous people from the time of the Spanish missions into the present. There is the debut novel by Cheyenne and Arapaho author Tommy Orange. Published in 2018, the book follows a large cast of Native Americans living in Oakland, California. Yay! Area and contains several essays on Native American history and identity. The characters struggled with a wide array of challenges ranging from depression and alcoholism to unemployment, fetal alcohol syndrome, and the challenges of living within quote unquote ambiguously non-white ethnic identity in the United States. All of the characters unite at a community powwow in the Oakland Coliseum in its attempted robbery. The book explores the themes of Native peoples living in urban spaces and issues of ambivalence and complexity related to Native struggles with identity and authenticity. There was favorably received and was a finalist for the 2019 Pulitzer Prize. The book was also awarded a gold medal for first fiction by the California Book Awards. Wandering Stars, the eagerly awaited follow-up to the Pulitzer Prize finalist Tommy Orange's breakout bestseller There, was the winner of the Penn Hemingway Award, the John Leonard Prize, the American Book Award, and one of the New York Times 10 Best Books of 2018. Wandering Stars traces the legacies of the Sand Creek Massacre of 1864 and the Carlisle Indian Industrial School through to the shattering aftermath of Orville Red Feather's shooting in There. Extending his constellation of narratives into the past and future, Tommy Orange once again delivers a story that is by turns shattering and wondrous, a book piercing in its poetry, sorrow, and rage, a masterful follow-up to his already classic first novel, and a devastating indictment of America's war on its indigenous people. So Dr. Dani,
Yo,
again, thank you so much for being here. And to kind of kick things off, I'm wondering why are Bad Indians, There, and Wandering Stars important texts to you? And what flights or journeys would you say they've taken you on as a scholar, educator, perpetual learner?
man, great question. So many places to go with this, so I'm gonna try to keep it as focused as humanly possible. First and foremost, I think both texts are exemplary when it comes to indigenous holistic knowledge, in that they are intellectual explorations. They draw from historical backdrops, archival documents, oral histories, etc. But at the same time, both texts will take you on an emotional roller coaster from
Yeah.
laughing out loud to literally weeping.
Yep.
And the entire spectrum in between to tension and all types of different places. And so it was that hard knowledge that really drew me into both of these places. I think so often with I wouldn't necessarily classify Tommy Orange as academic writing per se, but so often with scholarship, it tends to be dry. It doesn't speak to the heart in the same way. And some of the most powerful pieces are able to speak to both of these places,
Yeah.
right? Speak from this powerful place. And so I would say that also both texts are educators in the Latin sense of the word educare. What do they pull out from you? How do they speak to the reader's context? How do
Mm,
they speak uh, to different readers' context? So it's like on the one hand, there's what the author intended, but then on the other hand, it's what it inspires within the reader. And so there's
absolutely.
an important dialogue happening from there.
Mm,
Personally speaking, I'm coming from a Latin American indigenous context.
mhm.
So That's not a Native North American indigenous context. It's different in many ways. However, with Bad Indians in particular, that book really spoke in my mind because so many Native Californians they have similar experiences when it comes to missionization. They have similar relationships to Catholicism. They have similar relationships to legacies of enslavement and erasure and invisibilization. Moreover, it's within an urban context. It was those elements that really spoke to me personally.
Absolutely.
Um, I'm also coming out of a context where, I'm teaching in East Oakland. I'm teaching at Fremont High School at the time that I engaged with bad Indians. I'm
Mm,
making a transition into a graduate program.
yeah.
And you know, my experience in East Oakland as an educator was very powerful in many ways, particularly when it came to like liberatory education with Black studies, Latinx studies, and AAPI studies.
Mhm.
However, the emphasis on urban indigeneity wasn't always there
Yeah.
in the way that I wanted it to be. And so this text, these three texts really draw out that experience of urban indigeneity that's specific to the Bay Area
Mhm.
in a beautiful way.
Absolutely.
They're also just incredibly compelling, you know.
Yep.
Uh, Bad Indians deals with uh, representation, blood quantum issues, struggles with identity, struggles with being multiracial, um, and thankfully, I've had an opportunity to meet both authors and speak with them and humanize them in that way. And
Hmm.
so, speaking with Deborah Miranda, one of the things that really stood out to me was her love of Gloria Anzaldúa
Hmm.
and her love of Borderlands.
Hmm.
And that was kind of like a explosion in my head because I realized, oh, okay, I could see how she drew inspiration in Bad Indians from Borderlands. I could see the dialogue happening there. I can
Absolutely.
see a Nepantla borderland sensibility being expressed through within Bad Indians, right? A mosaic aesthetic, you know.
Absolutely.
And so and she does this by the incorporation of, regular research, archival research, poetry, oral history, and she kind of seamlessly delves into all of these different realms in ways that may seem uh, odd, but to me made a lot of sense.
Totally.
Um, and so, yeah, I guess I would leave it there for
Yeah.
that particular question. I did get a chance to meet with Tommy too, actually, and in his case, it was like I seen him at the Laney powwow, just walking around,
Yeah.
and it was just like, hey, what's up? This is who I am. I'm writing my dissertation on urban indigeneity and education. Would you be willing to talk to me about it?
Mhm.
Mad cool, gives me his cell phone immediately. It took a
Yeah.
little time to get on his schedule, but once I was on his schedule, made time, and so a lot of my relationship with his books comes through the rapport that we were able to establish through some of the interviews we did.
Oh, that's so
It helped me click and oh, that may be where this character is coming from. Oh, he's drawing inspiration from this, that, and the other. And
yeah.
so I think one of the reasons I love both of these texts so much is because I also have a little bit of a rapport with the authors, enough to kind of pull out a deeper level of analysis, or I hope to.
That's so that's so fucking cool. Thank you so much for sharing that. And like so many, yeah, I'm like, where do I begin? But I think where I'll begin is just like, man, one thing that I think you began with that I appreciate deeply is, you're talking about, kind of connecting to these things from a heart space. And one of the many things that having continued to appreciate you is the ways that, I see you fighting constantly to embody like never divorcing your mind and your heart and keeping them together, right? And just like how important I think that is, particularly, you know, like living in a world where we're like on path to global ecological collapse. The world is literally on fire, right? And like thinking about what does liberation, or at the very least like slowing things down on that path, towards that, right? But so I think that's like the first initial thought. But also yeah, like uh it's so cool that you got to, like, even if, not for a super long time, got to like have these connections with these authors, and then and learn more about, kind of the behind the scenes footage of like what helped them produce these amazing works, right? And so like even just like learning in this moment that like Ansardua had this huge like kind of motivating inspirational impact in Miranda's work is super dope, because Borderlands has meant so much to me. And then like when you were telling me like that, like, yeah, just like, it's like some of this is poetry, some of this is research, some of this is like, and how I was like, oh yeah, like how did I miss that? Like that's so fucking dope. And then and I think I texted you early this morning, right? The homie colleague, Professor Lisa Ang, right, who was a former on the pod. We got to meet Tommy Kaveh Akbar on Monday, and Tommy
Mm,
was like so cool, and so like, and I felt like really like excited. I was like nervous to even talk to him, but just like, to like even briefly just be like, yo, Tommy, like, as somebody who is like mixed heritage and, mother is Haudenosaunee Mohawk, that like, having all these characters and they're there who have these different proximities to their
mhm,
to their native, heritage
mhm.
and ancestry and identity. Like it was just like so amazing. Or just even tiny little things like I'm forgetting the name of the character, but like the young kid who's like riding his bike and listening to MF Doom, and
Exactly.
and him being able to like, because he understands some of the MF Doom lyrics, like be like, maybe I'm actually not dumb, right? And him talking about fetal alcohol, syndrome, and just like, and how his, connection to hip hop, and like I was, just I don't know, just like so many things are just like
In the
so,
Oakland landscape, not
man,
to mention like,
you feel me?
the Coliseum, the Fruitvale,
Ah,
the
well,
Diamond District,
and then
whatever, the hills, you know.
exactly, and
Oakland is a very prominent character in both of those books,
incredible.
and the other beautiful aspect of it is the way Tommy writes. He writes about Oakland in an indigenized way, in that there is a
Can you say more
profound,
about that?
yeah, there's just a profound relationship to the landscape.
Mm,
There's an intimate relationship to the landscape. The landscape is alive in a sense.
yeah.
It's a character in the story
Mm,
just as much as the characters are in the story.
man.
And I haven't seen an author do that with the urban landscape pertaining to urban indigeneity in the way that he's done it. So I appreciate that a lot
I,
about, because we know what narratives of Oakland are. It's
yeah.
like, dead, dying, you know, thrown away. And so there's a fundamental disruption of those narratives of as well.
Beautifully said. Um, well, and then and kind of jumping into like the first official question, right?
Sure.
This piece is around uh, you know, kind of rewriting history through storytelling. And so, in Bad Indians, Deborah Miranda interweaves personal history with historical documents to challenge dominant narratives about California's mission system. And I'm wondering, how do you see Miranda's work reshaping historical memory? How does this compare to the way Tommy Orange reconstructs Native histories and There and Wandering Stars, in your mind?
Yeah, so I think I brought my little board so I can provide a visual here.
Yeah, I love it.
I think both authors disrupt linear storytelling in a very powerful way.
Mm.
And
I'm
so,
sorry to interrupt. Just one thing, just for the folks who will only be listening. Um,
okay.
it might be useful just to describe some of what
Okay.
you're
So
referring
I'm
to.
holding up a dry erase board.
Yeah, there you go.
Spiral on it.
Yep.
And so when you're talking about indigenized storytelling, it doesn't go from beginning, middle, end.
Mm.
Or even like a Quentin Tarantino middle, beginning, end. It often has like you'll start maybe in the middle, somewhere along the cycle,
Yep.
then you'll go to a parallel experience that happened in the past. This especially happens in Wandering Stars. There's
Totally.
almost two parallel stories happening.
Yep.
There's one in the present day Oakland, and then there's another one pertaining to the character's experience with Richard Pratt and going to
Yeah.
uh, boarding schools. There's multiple stories happening parallel. And so what this describes is, you have the experience in the past, but history always cycles back.
Mm.
And ideally, if you're growing intergenerationally, if you're growing as humans, you take the experience from here and you're better able to navigate it
Mm.
here.
Mm. Wow.
Or it's just like you're repeating the same. There's also kind of the inverse of that. I'm just repeating uh, hard historical traumas, historical stories.
Yeah.
You see it again here. Similar experience returns back around. And so I don't know. I think both texts, but Wandering Stars in particular, disrupt cyclical storytelling.
Mm.
And the thing about cyclical storytelling is you can have kind of re-emerging traumas,
Mm.
but healing also happens in a cyclical way. So if
Gotcha.
you're being attentive to your trauma and you experience it here, it's really hard to get over, but you're probably going to revisit that trauma at some point in your life. And if you've been growing through it, you're going to be stronger and better able to deal with it here. If you're going through it, you'll be even stronger here.
Mm.
It's like the scar, the cut never goes away. The scar will always be there, but it'll get healed over time.
Mm.
And to me, these stories are kind of practices in that. Yeah, they have very painful aspects, but they're really about healing in many ways,
Mm.
right? So let's break down Wandering Stars. I think is better for this particular example, right?
Okay. Yep.
You have Richard Henry Pratt. For those who don't know who that is, he's most famous for the quote, "Kill the Indian, save the man."
Yep.
This is a Civil War general who ran a prison down in Florida that incarcerated Native people. And while running that prison as a warden, he said, and this story is described in Wandering Stars to a different degree. I'm just giving kind of an overview.
I forgot to say to our listeners, spoilers will abound. So I'm saying spoilers will abound.
Spoilers will
Sorry.
abound.
Okay. Go ahead. Go ahead. Sorry.
All the spoilers.
All the spoilers all over the place.
Um, But he ran this prison down in Florida that incarcerated Native people. And while there, he was like, well, they can be successful, helpful labor force. Let's not just incarcerate them. Let's use their labor. Let's make them productive members of a capitalist society.
How
And from
thought.
that premise, he develops the Carlisle School and the residential schooling system. So it's important to make the connection between prison and the residential schooling system up front. Now, the other interesting part of that particular historical moment is that you had another individual named Philip Sheridan, and he's most famous for the quote, "The only good Indian is a
Is
dead
that
Indian."
it? Yeah.
And so that was the hegemony amongst white dominance at the time. Let's kill them all off versus, nah, let's save their labor and their bodies, but let's kill the Indian within, right? So that's kind of what Tommy is wrestling to a certain extent, right? At the same time, he provides a nuanced and humanizing depiction of Pratt in a sense, which would be hard for someone like me to do.
Yeah.
But I think skilled author can do that.
Yep.
At the same time, he doesn't shy away from the damage that Pratt caused through the residential. He shows him as a flawed individual. And, what's interesting to me is he has this conversation happening about residential schools. And then in a parallel timeline, He's talking about modern day urban native youth who are experiencing kind of, I think it's like a head Royce type school. I forget the specific
Uh,
school.
okay.
It's a private school in Oakland where you're the only native student. You're struggling with identity issues. You don't have close proximity to ceremony or traditions. You have a few uh you're recovering from being shot in the first book,
Yeah.
the protagonist. And so he's having these two parallel timelines happening that is very interesting. And to me, it kind of speaks to this broader uh, theme of intergenerational trauma and intergenerational healing.
Yeah, well, and this is a perfect segue to the next question. So around intergenerational trauma, resilience, healing, because both Miranda and Orange explore the impact of colonialism, displacement, attempted, erasure, violence across generations, like you were talking about, right? The cyclical
Mhm.
abuse, right? And so I'm wondering, how do their narratives highlight the ways in which intergenerational trauma manifests in Native Indigenous communities? What role does or can storytelling play in healing and reclaiming identity, do you think?
Yeah. So I always hear that term intergenerational trauma, and I think it's important to unpack it just a little bit. So author Gerald Visner, indigenous author, he writes about something called post-apocalyptic stress syndrome or
Wow.
PASS.
I can't wait to hear about this.
So he's talking about how does PTSD manifest in the Native community intergenerationally. And so when you're talking about surviving a genocide, you've survived an apocalypse. Literally, you're post-apocalyptic. So, again, Wandering Stars, they talk about the Sand Creek Massacre as an apocalyptic event
Hmm.
and surviving that and what impact does that have. And so that's, it's different. So you'll have like in the Black community, you'll have Dr. Joy DeGruy talk about post-traumatic slave syndrome, which is a
Yep.
very specific thing.
Hmm.
Um, Within the urban context, you'll hear people talk about present traumatic stress syndrome or
Uh,
living in a violent urban community and not being able to leave it.
yeah.
So I think that distinction is important to make. Um, but I think in terms of so that the characters in the present are intergenerational survivors of an apocalypse,
Yeah. Wow.
and understanding it in that sense, and then understanding how do you then situate addiction, how do you situate, abuse, how do you situate self-harm within a post-apocalyptic context. It, um, and it's like, you know, so all of these books explore substance abuse, addiction, so numbing,
Hmm.
like sucking on Novocaine
Yeah.
to address this. And then all of these texts also explore the adage, hurt people hurt people.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
in order to survive an apocalypse, you have to become the apocalypse to a certain degree,
Wow.
and you carry forward that hurt. But I would also argue, there, in resistance, there's also healing, and
Hmm.
so I think it's important not to just, talk about the hurt and abuse and the addiction, but there's also like in all of these texts, there's a parallel healing track manifested in different characters, whether it's the auntie in Wandering Stars or the brother in Wandering Stars, whether it's Miranda herself, you
Mm.
know, weaving herself in and out of that narrative,
Mm.
in relation to her father's story, in relation to some of the historical archival documents,
Yeah.
in relation to her own exploration of the mission system here in California.
Yeah.
I think,
Oh, sorry.
go
Go ahead.
ahead.
Oh,
I would
oh, go ahead. Go ahead.
I would say the last thing that this particular question reminds me of has to do with a more pueblo originario example. This is a Maya example. There was a study done I might have talked to you about this, but again, what do these books bring up in me? Okay, there was a study done on the Maya people post the civil war in Guatemala, the massacre of the Mayan people that happened. And there was this really interesting phenomena amongst the Maya where they would crowd these movie theaters to watch Scream, that campy horror
Yeah. Oh,
film, like a
when we were kids,
slasher film.
for sure.
There's an anthropologist down there. She's like, why? Like, what's up with this? Why do people keep going to this same movie over it? Why is this movie so popular? Right? And what she concluded was Scream provided a certain type of collective catharsis,
Wow.
collective grieving, collective space to show terror in a way that is fake enough and campy enough that it's not real.
Yeah. Wow.
And so I think all of these books explore elements of that as well in interesting ways.
What an incredible, um, yeah, kind of like tying in of those things. Damn, I'm gonna be thinking about that Scream thing for like a long time. Thank you for
Well, I
telling.
mean, like, look, it, it,
Wow.
it, it it has applications. You and I both had students when we worked in East Oakland who would watch some corny ass, campy ass horror films, Leprechaun
Yeah.
in the Hood. And it's like, why are you watching Leprechaun in the Hood? Why are you legit afraid of leprechauns?
I remember that one.
And then this study, when you know that student and you know what they've been through and you know what they've lived through, Leprechaun in the Hood makes sense in the
Absolutely.
context of this study. It's
I mean,
like, okay, I could express fear in a way that's socially accessible.
yeah.
I
While
could
knowing that I'm physically safe.
exactly. You got it.
Jeez, man. Well, God, thank you so much for sharing that, Danny. And you were, just a moment ago, you were speaking to Miranda around the genre form piece, right? And so I wanted to go back to that briefly, but
Sure.
God, I'm never gonna forget this. Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
so Bad Indians blends memoir, poetry, oral history, historical analysis, and their Wandering Stars use these interconnected narratives, polyphonic storytelling. And so I'm curious your thoughts on how do you feel like these authors' choices of form challenge conventional, literary structures? Why might these, I love this word, hybrid approaches be particularly powerful in indigenous literature in your mind?
Yeah, so I mean, beyond the cyclical storytelling and the cyclical trauma and cyclical healing that's happening, uh, you know, I think the metaphor that I like to use is the mosaic aesthetic or the mosaic methodology.
Yes, sir.
And Deborah Miranda really nails this in Bad Indians. She talks about how colonization, and you have your own iteration. I've heard you talk about this when
I
it
was
comes
just
to
gonna
the
say that
Japanese
into
art.
Kuroi. Yeah.
So I'm gonna tell you my iteration of it, right? But Deborah Miranda in Bad Indian, she has this quote that I will never forget. I'm not gonna be able to say it perfectly, but basically well, okay, let me take a step back. I'm gonna share a story from my life
Time, brother, please. Yes,
and
yes.
how it connected to this mosaic methodology in Deborah Miranda. So I would say about 20, man, this is 2007. My wife and I were invited to ceremony over in Hopi Land on the Third Mesa. And it was a ceremony that was designed we were dancing to bring rain. You're in
Hmm.
the middle of the desert. So I still lived in Colorado at the time. It was a year before I moved to the Bay. So we drove like 14 hours,
Hmm.
middle of summer to get there. We arrived, we were received by the Hopi people, and we did ceremony. We danced 2 days under the sun, 2 days. Some of the members of our community were invited into the kiva. I was still very rookie back then, so I was not invited into the kiva. But
What can you, sorry, can you tell me what's the kiva?
kiva is a sacred place for the Hopi people. They're structures that are dug under the ground, and they're used to conduct ceremony. They're used for food storage, etc. It's a desert structure under the ground? Thank you for that question. Sometimes I just kind of go and I forget to define terms. Anyways, so we danced for 2 days and 2 nights, and at the end we circle up. And in that type of ceremony, you circle up and you try to you reflect on what did you learn here? What came to you while you were dancing? What insight did you receive, and can you share it with the broader community? And I remember I had this brother from not biological brother, but spiritual brother, by the name of Cidi Martinez. He's from DF, Mexico City. He's an Aztec dancer.
Mm,
And he says in that circle, he says, prior to the prior to the arrival of the Spanish in Latin America and the English in up north, indigenous knowledge systems were whole and complete. We
mm,
had philosophy, we had math, we had language, we had agriculture, and every other aspect of knowledge, written systems in certain places, oral systems in others, etc.
yep.
Complete holistic knowledge system. And he talks about a clay pot as a metaphor for that whole and complete knowledge system.
Mm,
He says the process of colonization took that whole and complete knowledge system and shattered it into 1,000 pieces.
yep.
That's the apocalypse I was talking about before.
Yep.
The apocalypse. So in the present, we really only have fragments oftentimes
Mm,
to deal with. Fragments of language, a word here, a phrase there, a song there, fragments of ceremony, fragments of agricultural knowledge, fragments of philosophy, what have you. And so, as descendants of indigenous people in the present, one of our tasks, tall order, is to gather as many of those fragments as we can,
yeah.
honor their integrity as much as we can, learn about them, and carry them forward and pass those on to the next generation.
Mm,
And that's what Deborah Miranda talks about in Bad Indians. Every archival document, every poem, every personal reflection, every oral history is another fragment, and she's putting it together. And she calls it a mosaic. She's like, there's no way we can rebuild this pot to what it was before. It will
Yeah,
never have the integrity that it had before.
sure.
That's impossible. And we get much more beautiful results if we take these pieces, we repurpose them for our context in the present, and
Mhm.
we build mosaics out of them. And
Mm.
then she's very clear on saying each one of these pieces is jagged. You handle it, it can cut you.
Ooh.
It can cut you, you know?
Yeah.
And that just, man, that hit me, that resonated so deeply with me that I used it to guide it guided my whole PhD journey. It
Yeah.
guided, the writings that I've done, and it guided the human being I wanted to be.
Yeah.
So that was kind of the level that this book hit me at.
Yeah. Man, you mentioned it briefly a moment ago, but yeah, there's just like so many different ways, right? Kintsukuroi in like the ways that I've used it in my research, right? Like align with so many of these pieces. I think particularly like what's being called to me at the moment and what you were saying, right, is like I think unconsciously at times, like particularly, if you have experienced some sort of intergenerational trauma, there can be these conscious or unconscious at times like wants to return to some like
Yeah,
pure, authentic, kind of indigenous expression of your ancestors, right? And
yeah,
and and oftentimes, like you were saying, like it's unattainable, right? And it maybe even unintentionally, unconsciously be harmful to like see that as some pristine, like, image of perfection or something like that.
sure.
And I love this the metaphor of the mosaic that you're speaking to, particularly around like it doesn't have to look exactly the way that it did prior to, colonization, these horrible forms of violence, right? And it shouldn't, right? And the piece that really jumped out at me that like, yeah, another piece of many things, you'd be dropping gems, man, but just like that will stick with me is like they're jagged and can cut you too. Right.
Yeah,
Man.
yeah. Because I mean, like, and so I don't know about your experience, but like I've had a very particular, I've written about language reclamation
Hmm.
in from my community, for instance, the Opata Nation, one of my communities.
Hmm.
And one of the only resources we have is this grammar from the 1600s
Yeah.
that was written as a missionization tool to conquer our people, to assimilate us, to enslave us. And it says it in the grammar, in the
Mm.
language. It's like, pick this corn or we will whoop you.
Yeah.
Have you gone to church today? Oh no, the whip, right? All it's all in that. And so I took that from the UC Davis library and I read through it, and it was utterly heartbreaking on one aspect.
Yeah.
It's like, damn, okay, that's the cut, right? This
Yep.
is this is the tool that was used for missionization and enslavement. And on the other hand, it's like, oh damn, I have my people's words for every direction. I have our animals and our food names.
Mm.
Oh damn, there's a Christian prayer in here. There's the Our Father, Our Mother, which is a Christian prayer, but damn, you change that father to father, mother, or creator, or some type of indigenous concept, you actually have something there,
Yeah.
right? So, that's kind of what I'm talking about in terms of these fragments and how they can cut you, but how they can also be very empowering. I actually created a board game for my kids
Oh
around
man.
the terms, like learn the animals, learn the numbers, learn the colors,
Yeah.
learn the territory. We built a territory on a map of
Yeah.
our people's territory, learn the different city names.
Yeah.
And in that particular board game, we uh, we flipped the narrative. So we kind of applied a indigenous futurist approach. What would have happened if our people had been able to push back these missionaries?
Mm.
Goal of the video, the goal of the game is to unite the villages before the missionaries arrive.
Oh my God, I love it.
And so, that's the type of thing that this type of literature inspires in me. That's what comes out when I engage with a book like Bad Indians or Wandering Stars.
Thank you so much for sharing that. I mean, I love that for so many reasons. I mean, the first is just like picturing, like your beautiful family and like, um, you know, playing this incredible game that you've created and like the inspiration coming from, these pieces, these texts, incredible texts we're talking about. But also, like it also made me think of like my own family and like, my mother's, because I imagine you would agree that, language, right, and culture is like this, right? And I'm
Yeah.
putting fingers together for the folks listening on audio, right? And it's like we talk about things like, lost in translation, like there are literal like words that don't necessarily translate across different languages. So I'm thinking about my mother's, attempts for many years at this point, right, to learn, study Mohawk language to the point where she is now, able to teach it to people, right? And,
Beautiful.
and then I think about like my units on like Kanaka Maoli, Native Hawaiian sovereignty, and like, reclamation of Hawaiian language and all the pieces you spoke to around like picking up the pieces and like and trying, be like, that weren't just like lost. Like there were, people explicitly made it a point to shatter these things and try to like cast them as far away as possible and make it
Learn
different.
libraries. And so it's hard fought knowledge. What your mama did to reclaim that language was hard fought years.
Yeah.
And
And
then trying to pass it down intergenerationally.
and I love like you talking about this board game you've created too, because I think particularly in a lot of kind of uh community circles where we're working very hard to be critically conscious to work towards justice with like everything that we have in our best and imperfect ways, right? There's a lot of at times, at least in my experience, like times where it's like when we think of resistance, it's like we think of taking up arms, we think of like being out in the streets and like these kinds of things, and like and forget maybe at times that it can be like creating a game for your children, right? Can be deeply empowering, beautiful like modes of resistance as well. So thank you so much for sharing that. Gonna switch gears just a teeny bit here,
Sure.
and and I know you've, talked a lot about this, thought a lot about this, but I'm thinking about, because you were speaking earlier to just, the ways that these are centering kind of urban indigenous identities. And so, there centers on urban native experiences in Oakland. Wandering Stars follows characters across different landscapes. Bad Indians revisits California's past and present. And so I'm curious, as a scholar of Native American Indigenous studies, someone who grew up in Colorado, a place that Orange highlights in his writing about the Sand Creek Massacre, as well as someone who has been in the Bay for close to 2 decades, right? I'm wondering how do these works complicate mainstream perceptions of what it means to be Indigenous in contemporary US?
Yeah. So, in many ways, I think first and foremost, and you know this, but I'll say it for those who are listening, there's a tendency to relegate Native people to the past, to
Hmm.
this archetype of and relic of the past. And
Yeah,
that tends to be an archetype of a Plains Native person, a Lakota person, an eagle feather wearing Plains warrior type archetype. Obviously, that archetype is vastly more diverse, or I mean, the reality is vastly more complicated, vastly more diverse. Hundreds of nations in North America alone, let alone thousands in the hemisphere. Um, and so when it comes to the Sand Creek massacre in Colorado specifically, you have to understand, like, so that was one of those apocalyptic moments
yeah,
to the point where there are no more Cheyenne people. There are no in Colorado. They all got moved
yeah,
forcibly to Oklahoma.
yeah,
So Tommy Orange talks about, I'm Cheyenne from Oklahoma. There's a
mhm,
historical reason for that,
yeah,
as that might have been the ancestral territory. The way that white supremacy played out in Colorado was elimination.
yeah,
We're going to kill off men, women, and children. We're going to take ears as tokens. We're going to, commit all types of atrocities, and then we're going to call them savages for doing that. And so currently, both Cheyenne and Arapaho nations, they don't have reservations in Colorado. The only reservations that exist are closer to the Four Corners region, and that's the Ute territory. There's
mhm,
two Ute reservations that are in closer proximity to the Four Corners region. They're right there next to Navajo territory, Hopi, the Taos Pueblos, etc. And so that needs to be marked. That
yeah,
said, on an annual basis, there are Arapaho relatives who come back to Sand Creek to commemorate that moment. Now, in terms of or that travesty,
yeah,
in terms of urban versus rural indigenous identities, and this is something that Tommy talks about in both books, and I think Deborah does too. You have program like post World War II programs of attempts of native termination. So to remove native designation from indigenous peoples, to remove the binational bilateral agreements between the U.S. and native nations. And then native termination is coupled. One of the aspects of native termination is native relocation. So
yeah,
that was the project of, okay, let's get them off the reservations and into the urban areas.
mhm,
You have very specific urban areas that were targeted, Denver being one of them. So
mhm,
you do have a large uh, urban native, multinational urban native community there.
mhm,
Minnesota, LA, of course, and the Bay. And there's many, Phoenix, there's many others.
okay.
Um, what's interesting, and we've talked about this briefly, but the dude who was put in charge of native relocation and termination program, his last name, I believe, is Myers, but we might have to fact check that. He was the same dude who, under the Roosevelt administration, was put in charge of Japanese internment.
Oh, you're right. No, you're absolutely right. I remember now.
And so
Yep.
you have the person who was in charge of Japanese internment later in charge of native termination and native relocation.
Yo, and
Um,
so many of those incarceration camps for Japanese Americans were right next to reservations.
exactly. And so, and then you have, stories of resistance within that context of, Native people supporting Japanese people and vice versa, within those contexts. And so, that that's what really stands out to me. And those relocation programs, they were very much assimilation programs as well. Let's get you off of the res. Let's, get you into a trade job or whatever. Now,
Yeah.
the the unforeseen outcome is that you have people from all different tribes coming together in the same place, building solidarity together, and that's how you get the emergence of the American Indian movement, which is very much an urban native movement. That's
Hmm.
how you get the occupation of Alcatraz. That's how that's the powwow circuit existed before that, but it's reinforced
Yeah.
within these urban native spaces. And so, in there, powwow plays a predominant role.
Man,
But
that's
um,
so intense.
which is that's an interesting story in and of itself, how that one came to be, right? I don't know if it's within the scope of this particular podcast, but um, it just suffice it to say you could trace powwow back to um, the Wild West shows during the Buffalo Bill Cody days.
Yep.
And that's another Colorado dude.
Mm,
Buffalo
I know
Bill.
that.
Yeah.
Okay.
They got like a Buffalo overlook right outside of Denver that goes after his
Wow.
name. I don't know if he's from there, but I know he spent a lot of time there.
Okay. Um,
I don't know if I answered the question. I don't know if I was
no, no,
all over
you
the place with
absolutely,
that one, but
absolutely. Like, no, yeah, I mean, just where my mind is at the moment is just like, just wanting to, thank you for all the ways that you continue to teach me and remind me of, deeply important pieces specific to indigeneity in what we today call the Americas. Um, and
yeah,
and I think you've kind of been doing this throughout, right? But I wanted to kind of return to thinking about the role of institutions, right? Which we've talked about for years with regards to all the work that like we do in education, right? But Miranda critiques the Catholic Church like in their role in Native oppression, and Orange examines the effects of government institutions, boarding schools, foster care, right? And so I'm wondering, how do you feel like these works expose the ongoing impacts of institutional violence, and what parallels might be drawn between the critiques that Orange has and that Miranda has?
I love this question so much. Because the beauty of this question is you're talking about, man, where to start with this one? Let's take it back to Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz for a second. Indigenous Peoples History of the U.S. One of the things that she posits in there is that we misimagine how the U.S. was created. We think of manifest destiny east to west, right? But the reality is the first colonial power in the territory that we call the U.S. was the Spanish Empire in New Spain. And it was the vast majority of, everything that has a Spanish name: Texas, Colorado, California, Oregon, Montaña, Arizona, and on and on and on and on, right? And so we very rarely conceptualize colonization in that way, starting from Mexico coming up. Anyways, so what Deborah is talking about, what Miranda is talking about in her critique of the Catholic Church, she's talking about the ongoing. So oftentimes they'd send the missionaries as a spearhead of colonization. They'd
Yeah.
send the missionaries before they'd send the soldiers, and then the missionaries would be there trying to peacefully assimilate, and then the soldiers would offer kind of a violent alternative. You either assimilate or you die,
Yeah.
which is why you have so many Mexicanos and Latino people with indigenous features that don't speak their language or don't have any connection to their indigenous heritage. It's because of 100-year project of you will have that ancestry, but you might not have that connection. That's why that dynamic exists. And I think she really speaks to that. She talks about the missions in California. She talks about how all of those missions were built with slave labor of indigenous peoples,
Mhm.
enslaved labor. She talks about the mission unit in the present and how every fourth grader up until very recently had to buy this little kit and build their little
I did
benevolent
that shit.
mission.
Yeah.
And what's wild about that, like that aspect of that particular, because and then she offers an alternative mission unit in that book.
Uh,
But that inspired me in my dissertation. I interviewed all kinds of urban native folks to tell me about their experience with the mission unit. And man, those answers were so wild and varied. It went from I just wanted to, I bought the kit and I built it to get the A to I built a historically accurate depiction of the mission and failed that shit. Dude, no, the wildest one came from Carol Wapipa, who runs the Intertribal Friendship House,
Okay.
or did for a long time. I'm not sure if she's still there, but she actually had AIM come into her children's school and like do kind of a, a teaching,
Wow.
a unexpected surprise teaching on the mission. So, um, when it comes to my people, when it comes to the Opata Nation, we were forced to build missions too. All of our villages, our sacred sites, churches were, or our sacred sites were destroyed, and churches with missions were built on top of those. And so that hit very. Anytime I go into, it's hard for me to go into missions. I'm not even gonna lie. Like I tried to go into one or two, and it's just like the heart not like I start tearing up
Yeah.
because I know why they're there, why they were built. I know the torture happened within them. I know people are buried in there, and depending on the mission, it could even be my relatives. So you
Yeah.
go down to like Arizona way, there's missions in Tucson that I know some of my relatives helped build,
Absolutely.
and so that's the Catholic side, I would say. And this is why I like putting these authors in dialogue. Tommy Orange speaks more towards kind of the Protestant Christian approach to genocide and assimilation. And this is more of a reservation system. Let's force you off of your land onto a reservation. Let's kill you off, or let's let's kill the Indian, save the man residential school approach.
Yeah.
And then what's even wilder about this is when I spoke with Tommy, and he has some of these veins in his writing.
Mm.
Um, his father is a practitioner of the Native American church, which is a peyote way, and
Uh,
his mother is a devout Christian.
okay.
So even within the home, he had these two seemingly diametrically opposed narratives that
That
were able to live harmoniously
sure.
in within his home. And so he's able to speak to that in very powerful ways, I think, in some of his writing.
Oh man, that's so beautiful. I mean, just like on a personal level, it immediately hits just because, on one side of my family, there's, big pieces around liberation theology,
Yeah.
Protestant Christianity pieces, and then also, Buddhism has been huge in my life. Jodo Shinshu and my Jichan was Shinto. And then in this last period of my life, connecting to Haudenosaunee spiritual practices, things like that.
Mhm.
But just like yeah, and like you were saying, like seemingly would be diametrically opposed, but like being able to create that mosaic, as you were saying.
Yeah, when you get down to the ways that grandmas practice Christianity, and like they're actually kind of Christ-like in the way that they go about things, that's where the narrative actually makes sense between the traditions. When you get down to like the Crusades and like the Spanish Inquisition And that type of Christianity, that's where they're diametrically opposed.
That's thou wow. Um, and I love too just the ways you're unpacking uh juxtaposing the kind of the like Anglo-Saxon Protestant kind
Yeah.
of means of colonization, attempted genocide with the kind of Spanish Catholic kind of ways of being and seeing in those violent directions. uh,
Yeah,
I
and
think
that's where narratives of mestizaje come in, and like Spanish caste system and colorism within Latin America versus the black-white binary
yeah,
on the Anglo-Saxon Protestant side. And then, but when it comes to Native Californians specifically, the vast majority of the up until 1848, it was Spanish up until 1820, and then Mexican from 1820 to 1848, and then post gold rush, you're talking about one of the foulest genocides in world history
yeah,
of Native Californians. And so you have an even bigger emphasis within that context. And I think Miranda talks about this too. Within that context, there's this massive onus to not appear native.
hmm,
You know, if you're brown in California post gold rush and you had a choice, you could be, oh, no, I'm Mexican.
yeah,
I'm not native.
yeah,
And, a lot of native Californians had to make that choice in order to survive or die, and so then that's why you have a lot of native Californians with Spanish surnames. That's why you have um, you know, and then even just in my research, there were just so many multiracial urban native people. And a lot of them were multiracial, like Mexican and native,
yeah,
you know.
yeah.
So
And you immediately made me think of one of my closest friends. I won't name here, but I'm
yeah,
hoping she'll be a guest at some point. If you're listening, I
yeah,
love you. But she's a Diné Tiwa heritage, right? Has a Spanish last name, and like, as me and her have talked for hours on end around just like, kind of some of her upbringing around, yeah, like, family being saying they were Mexican, and keeping it under wraps that they were indigenous because of just like violence, and kind of a constant threat around those pieces.
yeah.
And
And that's learned behavior. That's learned behavior from a lot of indigenous Mexican people did that exact same thing, had those same practices, because this was kind of the same territory for the longest.
yeah, and and I think where my mind is going in the moment too. I mean, and I want to move to a question around these very themes of like survivance, cultural continuity,
Sure.
um, and but I'm recalling. I think it was, I can't remember if it was you or maybe Jeff that like put this on my radar years ago, but Maslow's hierarchy of needs, essentially stolen, appropriated, I think from Blackfoot Nation,
Yeah,
uh, right? And like, and
that was
how
me. I'll put that on your radar.
yeah, that's what's up. Right. And then but one thing they talk about, right, is like cultural perpetuity,
Yeah.
right? And so, in this vein, right, despite the violence, the historical erasure depicted in both these works, right, that we're talking about, or all these texts, both authors emphasize survival, cultural persistence, cultural perpetuity.
Mhm.
So I'm wondering, how do Miranda Orange depict survivance, in your mind? What lessons can be drawn from their portrayals of indigenous resistance and adaptation? That's the first part. And actually, maybe I'll add a little piece here because one thing that I've, deeply appreciated, about, our relationship is how much I've gained from learning about, all of the intentional, powerful work that you've done to think about gender, sexuality, particularly from an indigenous perspective.
Mhm.
But yeah, so sorry, that was a lot, but I'll say again, so in thinking about survivance, cultural continuity, what lessons can be drawn from the portrayals of indigenous resistance in these works, do you feel?
So many. Um, survivance, survival, resistance, persistence. First and foremost, that's another Gerald Visner term, as I understand it. So, same dude who coined post-apocalyptic stress syndrome.
Can you
Uh,
spell that last name for me just so I can.
Visner, Vizenor, an incredible indigenous scholar. So I got to shout him out first and foremost and recommend him to everybody.
Absolutely.
But so survivance and cultural continuity in both of these texts fundamentally disrupt narratives of erasure and invisibilization
Yeah.
and victimhood. And it's a demonstration of perpetual resistance. I know there's addiction and abuse and violence and all of these things, but there's also an overcoming. You know, for bad Indians in particular, the text itself is a representation of overcoming.
Hmm.
The book itself, the creation of because to me that's a historical text. There's stories in there on like Ohlone creation stories of the Diablo Mountain, the quote unquote Tushtak, aka the Diablo Mountain
Hmm.
over there. Um, and all of that disrupts erasure and invisibilization. I do actually want to talk about that a little bit in the urban context because what ends up happening, like demographically speaking, numbers wise, because Native folks are such a small percentage and they're often miscounted,
Hmm.
you'll end up with a situation Native people being like below 1% demographically.
Uh,
And then when it comes to resource allocation and things of that nature, then it's easy to say, oh, that's less than 1%. We don't need to fund that. We don't need to support that. It happens at universities, but oftentimes it's miscounted. Oftentimes you have multiracial Native people who are misclassified as African American or Latino or Asian American or white.
yeah.
And that's not to mention the massive like indigenous population from places like Guatemala and Oaxaca and the
Yeah.
Zapoteco and all of that. So first and foremost, both of these texts they disrupt that erasure and invisibilization simply by putting forth indigenous narratives created by indigenous people in a way that is compelling, in a way, particularly in Tommy Orange's case, in a way that is widespread
Hmm.
and very popular.
Yeah.
So I would say that. Let me see.
Is it okay if I ask a follow-up question?
Yes.
Well, when I got to, see Kaveh Akbar and Tommy Orange this past Monday, one thing that I was just like super struck by that I asked them a question about was just like they have this beautiful, like incredibly close, trusting, emotionally intimate friendship, right? And
Mhm.
so I asked them this piece just around like, as two cis het or sorry,
Yeah.
not cis het, cis men, because Kaveh, he talked about being cis het passing, but
Mm.
it's cis men, right, particularly of color. Um, like just we generally just get discouraged from those kinds of close friendships, right? And
Yeah.
I would argue it does incredible damage to us to not be able to access emotional intimacy with other men, especially men of color, right? And so I guess I'm curious kind of in what ways you see or kind of think about indigenous kind of uh, practices around authentic gender expression, and just things around, sexuality, um,
Yeah.
in even in small ways, showing up in either of these texts as far as resistance to, white supremacist heteronormative patriarchy.
Hmm. Okay. Um,
That was a lot. I'm sorry.
no, 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 it's not a lot. I'm
My
just
fault.
what immediately jumps to mind is the notion of extended kinship networks that
Mm,
are it's an indigenous ethos in every community. And so you are not like in the Western world, you're solely an individual. It's
yeah.
very individualistic
Yep.
in the indigenous world, and it's really expressed through both of these books in different ways.
Mm,
But in the indigenous world, you are in perpetual interdependence with those around you
yeah.
and with your family, etc. So, but simultaneously, particularly in Tommy Orange's case, he talks about how the Western world works to isolate you.
Yeah.
and works to create this individualism.
Yep.
And for my people, we have like this very robust extended kinship network where you have terms for like your mom's oldest sister, your mom's second oldest sister, your godparent. You have
Yeah.
in terms of like this tight friendship amongst cis hetero men or cis passing hetero men or however you frame that. There's terms in my language for that like strong kinship bonds between men where they're not biological brothers, but they're like brothers,
Uh,
adopted brothers. And there's terms and things like that to
yeah.
really represent a broader fabric of a community and show how you are literally related to other people, whether even if it's not biologically, you're related by, degrees of separation or
Sure.
what have you. So that's the first thing. Secondly, another indigenous ethos, and I think it's probably more expressed in Miranda's work than Tommy's, but um, there's an indigenous ethos of uh, like at minimum three genders, between three and five genders, depending on what nation you're talking about. So, you know, Dene, for instance, have a conceptions of five genders based on my understanding. But almost every nation has at least three genders, and so within that context, what we would call non-binary or quote unquote trans in the Western world, although I don't want to conflate terms,
Mhm.
is normal, and there's a 1,000-year history
Yeah.
of that here in the Americas,
Mhm.
and so I think it's important to note that. Um, that said, there also tends to be fairly rigid gender roles without gender, no, gender roles, not non-rigid gender roles without the gender hierarchy. So
Mm.
so
Mm.
what does that mean? That means like in the Western world, there's a condemnation, for instance, on what mothers do, quote
Yeah.
unquote, right? Cooking, cleaning, the traditional women's roles. In indigenous,
Active
pre-
labor, quote unquote. Yeah.
yeah, exactly. In pre-colonial indigenous societies, those roles were seen as equitable or equal or
Mhm.
just as important to the broader fabric of the community.
Absolutely.
But beyond that, um, if you didn't like your role, you could adopt another one. You could
Mm.
be a woman and become a warrior. You could be a man and
Mm.
become a cook. And as long as you were willing to adhere to what as long as you were willing to be accountable and responsible to what that meant
Yeah.
within the broader community. And so um I think it's interesting. I think the way that Tommy Orange talks about this, it's more so as an urban native person in search of
Got it.
these broader conceptions of what it means to be indigenous.
Yeah.
Um, Deborah Miranda, I think, talks about it more from an embodied place.
Mm. I really appreciate that differentiation. Ooh, um, only because of time, I want to switch gears
Sure.
towards this last question before we start to close out. And
Yeah, I got to pick up my kids soon.
really, no, but I can't thank you enough.
What happened to the time?
I know, right? This has been a blast. So this last question before we start closing out, is kind of around like ethics with regards to representation, right? And so
Mm.
both Bad Indians and Orange's novels engage with these deeply personal, painful histories, right? At times, while also having like these really, beautiful, kind of joyful aspects as well. But I'm wondering, how do you perceive these authors navigate the ethics of representing personal and community trauma? And what do you feel like are responsibilities that writers and scholars have when telling stories about Native experiences?
Yeah, so both of these authors are incredibly humanizing to the Native experience. And what I mean by that is the good, the bad, and the ugly,
Mm.
the full spectrum, not a romanticized perception, not a demonized perception.
Yeah.
Historically speaking, um, you have the tropes of the noble savage
Yeah.
and kind of the blood-hungry native
Yeah.
that tend to fall into non-native tropes.
Like
And
horns and
so,
halos.
huh?
It's like horns and halos, and them trying to.
Horns and halos, exactly, or the virgin whore dichotomy, or
Sure.
any number of these kind of
Increase.
ways of dehumanizing somebody through creating a binary. That tends to happen, and what both of these authors do is they disrupt that through humanizing characters and humanizing themselves.
Yep.
In Miranda's case, I also just want to point out that there is a fundamental difference around how indigenous writers write about themselves and their own communities and how non-indigenous writers write about themselves and their own communities.
Hmm.
And um, that's not to say that non-indigenous writers can't and shouldn't write about Native people, because I think it can be done responsibly, but it is to say there's a fundamental difference. So I would point people towards the show Reservation Dogs,
It's like one of
created
my
by
favorite.
Sterling Harjo. That's a show written from an indigenous perspective. Sterling is related to Joy Harjo, who was an indigenous poet laureate. Comes from a literary background, and that really comes through in in that book, or I'm sorry, in that show.
Yeah.
And that show is like these books. It will take you on that roller coaster journey where
Yeah.
you will be laughing, you will be crying because you're laughing so hard, and you
Ooh,
will be crying because it's utterly painful and devastating.
absolutely.
And he will take you on that full humanizing journey in Reservation Dogs.
Man.
A good example of a non-indigenous person, in my view, okay, I'm sure there'll be pushback on this. A good humanizing example of a non-indigenous person doing a film about Native people is the new Predator, in my view.
Oh, is that Prey?
Prey, my bad. It's part of the Predator
Yeah,
franchise,
yeah.
but
No,
Prey,
absolutely. Yeah, yeah.
yes.
Yeah.
And the
I
reason is
watched that a couple times.
he did a full, I believe it's Comanche language. He did a full version of that in the Comanche language. He there's very few white people in the movie at all, and they're kind of side characters.
And they're
Um,
colonizers, so there's that historical accuracy.
it's historical accuracy. He really, or I don't know if it was a he or she who was the director, or they, but there was an attempt to, or community feedback throughout the process was present.
Yeah.
And yeah, I thought it was really well done because the fact of the matter is those allies are needed, those accomplices are needed,
Sure.
and they need to do a good job when they do it, and they need to be careful um and do it very deliberately. And so yeah, that's how I would talk about the ethics of representation in these books.
Thank you so much for that.
Um,
I appreciate it. And as we close out, and I mentioned this in the beginning of the episode, Dr. Dani is an incredible artist, musician. And so something that I always close with is I ask, what is a song, a musical artist, and or an album that you would pair with these books?
man,
I know it's a tough one.
man.
It could be multiple because there's multiple books.
Um, right off top, I would point people towards Snotty Nose Res Kids
Mhm.
Trap Lines. It's a fantastic project. They're First Nations from Canada. I would point people towards an artist named Dreezes. He's
Mhm.
also First Nations from Canada, but he speaks to a lot of these same issues. Um, Let me see. In terms of like the US, I'd point people towards Layla June and Desiree Harp from Audio Pharmacy
Mhm.
and the Audio Pharmacy fam. I
Yeah.
think those pair well. And then when it comes to Native Latin America, I would point you towards Renata Flores
Mhm.
and Brisa Flo and a Mapuche group called Wechequeche Nitravun.
Mm.
And I'll leave it at that.
Nice. We got a whole playlist there for y'all.
Whole playlist.
And then last question is, or not a question necessarily, but could you please complete the following sentence? People should read Bad Indians, There, There, and Wandering Stars because dot dot dot.
Because it is a humanizing portrayal of urban native people in the Bay Area.
Yee! Love it.
Yeah.
Love it. Um, Dr. Danny, such an honor, a pleasure to talk with you today. Thank you so much for the gift of your time. Appreciate you tremendously. Thank you for being here. I appreciate it.
Yes, brother. Thank you for holding this platform.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, so good people, that is it for us. Hoping you have an amazing week ahead, and we hope that you enjoyed this flight. Peace.